Everyone, look, this is the ugly cow my husband has to feed for life. Ariel said that right in front of me under the gaze of hundreds of people, and I stood there motionless as if humiliation itself could freeze the air solid. I heard the murmurs of laughter, the clinking of champagne glasses, and Jalen, my son, snorting with amusement beside his wife. But what Ariel didn't know was that the very moment she pushed me to the bottom, I was standing at the highest point. I, Marceline Reed, was the one holding the signature that could save her family's $870 million corporation. She thought she was winning on that stage. No, she had just collapsed the future of the entire Hartwell family with one venomous sentence. I left the party not because I was hurt, but because my power never required me to stay. I stayed silent, and it would be that silence that destroyed them. And if it were you standing before someone abusing their power and trampling your dignity, would you stay silent and endure, or let the truth expose who they really are? Fire. Share your thoughts. Follow, because their downfall has only just begun. I am Marceline Reed, 52 years old, a dark-skinned woman who has walked through boardrooms colder than any Chicago winter. A CEO whose silence often weighs heavier than another person's shouting. I am used to being measured, watched, and underestimated, but I never imagined that my first meeting with my future daughter-in-law's family would bring a different kind of coldness, the kind wrapped in silk, crystal, and aristocratic laughter. When the doors of the Hartwell estate opened, I stepped into a space so luxurious it seemed arranged for the sole purpose of reminding others of its wealth. The ceiling stretched high, coated in warm golden light that fell in sharp needles. The scent of expensive perfume floated thick in the air, overly sweet, like something meant to mask a deeper rot underneath. I felt the shift in the atmosphere the moment I entered the living room. Conversations paused for a single breath, just long enough for their eyes to sweep over me, long enough for me to understand they had already decided my worth before I even took a seat. A brief silence, thin as thread, but sharp enough to scrape the edges of dignity for anyone who noticed. I am used to being underestimated, but I have never stood beneath anyone. I walked deeper into the room, keeping my back straight, my breath steady, as if I were the one who crafted every light glinting on that marble floor. Ariel descended the curved staircase, moving as though the ground itself had been paved for her alone. My daughter-in-law, 26, delicate yet razor-edged, shaped by a lifetime of privilege and a lineage polished with carefully cultivated arrogance. Her eyes swept across me, unhurried but cold, like an appraiser examining an object that didn't quite fit the decor. She looked at me the way one might regard a piece of furniture that clashes with the room. A short look, but loaded, as though my presence disrupted the aesthetic harmony they'd spent generations perfecting. No one spoke, but the air hummed with unspoken judgments about my skin, my quiet composure, the parts of me they believed unworthy of this chandelier-lit world. Ariel stopped in front of me, tilted her head slightly, and let out a thin smile. "Oh, you're really his mother. I thought something else." The words fell softly, feather-light, but dipped in venom. I looked into her eyes, unflinching. That was how I survived in business, and it was how I peeled back the masks of people who relied too heavily on inherited power. Jalen stood behind his wife silent, head slightly lowered, as if trying to avoid the tension he sensed, but couldn't rise to confront. He used to be the gentle boy who held my hand as a child and asked how to become strong. Now he stood in the glow of a world he didn't fully belong to, yet clung to, letting the distance between us stretch wider than the hallway I had just crossed. Then Miranda Hartwell appeared, Ariel's mother. A woman whose posture alone said she viewed the world as a chessboard and anyone outside her circle as disposable pawns. Her voice was soft but sharp enough to pierce the carefully staged elegance around us. Ariel, don't worry. Some people are simply born at the bottom. I heard it clearly, like a steel door closing behind me. She didn't say it loudly, only loudly enough for me to hear, as if testing whether I would recoil. A test meant to determine whether I could be pushed aside with a handful of contemptuous words. I remained upright, unmoved. I had long learned how to withstand people who tried to measure others by lineage or skin color. People like Miranda relied on visible power, the kind that needed diamonds around the neck to feel real. That kind of power always blinded its owner. No one in that extravagant room knew I occupied a position far beyond their reach, or that in a matter of days, my signature could pull the ground out from under the very empire they were so proud to display. I took in the room the way they all pretended ease, while their eyes flickered back at me, assessing, judging, deciding I did not belong. Their arrogance was so palpable, it felt like a thin fog drifting just above the marble floor. I offered no response to the words floating between us. I didn't have to raise my voice in a room where my silence alone unsettled a few of them. I observed, and in their eyes I saw entitlement so deep it had become their only truth. They thought I was smaller than them, and that belief made them dangerously confident. Yet what stayed with me from that meeting was not their disdain, but the unmistakable feeling that everything I witnessed was only the prelude. A door was waiting to open. A larger, more deliberate humiliation was already being prepared for me behind the scenes. I didn't know they had arranged a far crueler spectacle for me right after this. That evening, the lights in the banquet hall flared like a stage built for the displays of elegance the Hartwell family loved to boast about. I walked in with Jalen, seeing rows of long tables draped in white, thin glassware that would ring with a whisper at the slightest touch. Guests stood in small clusters, speaking in soft tones, yet something in the air felt poised, as if I had stepped into the center of a storm, waiting for the right moment to break. Faces turned toward me quick but sharp, as if watching a background character stray into the spotlight of someone else's show. Ariel appeared in the middle of the hall, her hair pulled back neatly, each step measured and deliberate. When her eyes met mine, I saw a faint glimmer of satisfaction, like someone who had just finalized a hidden scheme. I didn't know what that scheme was, but instinct told me it would not be gentle. Ariel moved toward the stage, accepted a microphone from the event coordinator, and her smile tightened like a thin thread stretched too far. The music faltered for a brief second, then stopped entirely, leaving behind a silence that felt as though an invisible hand had squeezed the whole room. I stood among the crowd, feeling the weight of every gaze shift toward the stage. Ariel swept her eyes across the hall, her confidence shining like a polished surface. "Thank you all for being here," she said, her voice clear and bright, spreading across the room. Every word smoothed the air as though she were preparing it for something sharp. When her eyes found me again, her smile sharpened, taking on a hint of cruelty. The room went utterly silent, as if everyone had been waiting for this precise moment. "Everyone," Ariel said, "this is the ugly cow my husband has to feed for the rest of his life." The words dropped like a heavy object hurled from a great height. I heard a few people laugh, the kind of laughter held back, but loud enough to vibrate against my chest. My head tilted slightly, not from shock, but from how viciously she delivered that sentence in front of 300 people with a triumphant expression, as if she had just removed an unsightly stain from her world. I caught several eyes watching me, quietly waiting to see how I would break. I saw Jalen near the stage, only a few steps from Ariel. My son looked at me, his lips lifting into an awkward smile he thought was harmless. He walked toward me, speaking in a whisper meant to soothe. "Mom, it's just a joke. You're overreacting," he said. I looked into his eyes and found no trace of remorse, only the discomfort of someone afraid his wife's party might lose its perfection. As if I were a small inconvenience he needed to push aside to keep Ariel pleased. That moment pierced deeper than Ariel's words. My son stood there amid the scattered laughter, treating the humiliation I had just endured as a playful tease. I felt the cold marble floor beneath my feet, the distance between us widening like a sheet of ice cracking apart. His eyes darted around the room, worried about others' opinions, unable to see that I was right in front of him. The air in the hall felt drained, leaving only stray laughter and low murmurs drifting around us. Ariel remained on stage, tilting her head slightly, like someone savoring the success of her performance. The golden lights illuminated her face, highlighting the smug satisfaction that had been waiting to surface. I wanted to leave, not out of shame, but because I understood that any words I spoke would be twisted into the fragile pride they expected from someone they believed beneath them. I turned toward the crowd, searching for a path out. The sound of high heels clicked somewhere behind me, but I didn't look back. I only wanted a stretch of silence where I could breathe. I walked down the long hallway leading outside, the light dimming as I moved farther from the noise. Behind me, the music resumed, muffled by distance. My heart ached sharply, not because of the insult hurled before 300 people, but because of Jalen's eyes, the ones that chose his wife over me and left me standing as if I were a stranger causing trouble. I was not only humiliated, I was abandoned. And that abandonment was the blow that told me the night was far from over. This was only the beginning of something far more cruel waiting for me ahead. I left the banquet hall in a state that words could not fully define. It wasn't an outburst, nor the kind of fury that seeks something to destroy. It was a cold emptiness spreading from my chest down to my legs, making each step feel like I was walking on a sheet of thin ice. The lights behind me remained bright, the music had resumed, but everything felt distant, as if the entire evening had become a bad dream, separated from reality. I walked along the long hallway toward the garden, outside my arms at my sides stiff, as though someone had just shut a door inside my heart. I took a deep breath but felt no air. What I felt was a hollow silence sitting between my ribs. People assume pain must scream, must break, must fall apart. But pain does not always sting. Some kinds of pain freeze, settling quietly cold enough to stop the body from reacting. I stood under the curved glass canopy, looking at my reflection in the door, seeing a woman who remained still, not broken, only pulling her pride into a small guarded corner. Laughter from inside the hall seeped through the gap in the door, spreading like thin ink. Someone called Ariel's name, someone else raised a glass. I heard the whisper of several women beneath the music, the soft shuffle of shoes across the polished floor. I stayed still for a few seconds, letting all those sounds drift away, then continued toward the main garden doors. I wanted to leave the place filled with 300 eyes, shining with delight at someone else's humiliation. As I placed my hand on the door handle, a voice rose behind me, loud enough to slice through the music, clear enough that I knew it was meant for me. "Good job, Ariel. You must put it back in its proper place." Miranda's voice reached me like a cold blade at the base of my neck. Each word fell slowly, deliberately, like a proclamation of victory. There was no accident in her tone. Nothing about it felt like a misunderstanding. It was the confirmation of a plan crafted long before the party, sharpened and polished until its cruelty would land with perfect precision. A carefully staged humiliation engineered to push me down, to turn me into entertainment for those who believe themselves untouchable. I stood still, my back to the hall, my face toward the garden. Every syllable Miranda spoke sank into me like a layer of ice forming over still water. I heard Ariel respond, her younger voice wrapped in the pride that her mother had shaped in her for years. They weren't hiding their satisfaction. They believed I had walked far enough not to hear them, or they simply didn't care whether I did. In their eyes, I was someone beneath them, someone who deserved to be guided by public degradation. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not to retreat, but to imprint their voices clearly in my mind. I understood then that what had happened in that hall wasn't a moment of impulsiveness from Ariel, not a joke taken too far by a privileged young woman. It was a lesson on class they thought I needed, a message from the Hartwell family carefully prepared to remind me of the place they assumed I should occupy. I opened my eyes and stepped down into the garden lit by soft yellow lamps. The space felt quieter, lighter, yet something in me had shifted. The frozen emptiness began to thaw, not into anger, but into a sharper awareness. They believed they could assign my worth, that a few chosen words could define my position in their world. They believed their social power was the largest net in the room, capable of trapping anyone. They had no idea who I was. I looked up at the dark, smooth sky and felt my breath return fully for the first time that night. My steps grew steadier as I moved away from the garden, heading toward the gate beyond. Keeping silent was all I wanted, not to endure, but to remember. My silence would become the mirror, reflecting everything they had done. I passed the row of stone columns leading to the front courtyard where my car waited. With each step, it became clearer that I had just witnessed the true face of a family accustomed to standing above others, a family that never imagined consequences could reach them. A family convinced I would walk away with the wounds they inflicted and continue on as if nothing had happened. They thought I was the victim of the evening. They were wrong. I stepped through the large gate, leaving the bright lights behind. Before me stretched a quiet road, still and long, opening like a new chapter. The cold emptiness inside me was gone, replaced by something deeper and steadier. They had no idea who they had just provoked. The road leading to the parking area was washed in warm yellow light falling from the row of stone columns, stretching like an exit path after a night full of thorns. I walked slowly, letting my breath steady, letting every blade that had cut through me in that banquet hall dissolve into the cold air. That night did not leave sharp pain behind it, left a depth of silence so heavy I heard the sound of my heels tapping each step as if striking the hollow place inside me. I knew I needed to get far from here to put everything back where it belonged. My car waited not far from the gate, the driver bowing slightly as he opened the door, yet my hand paused on the handle. Something was waiting for me ahead, a feeling like a tightened string pulling behind me. I got into the car, letting the door close and shut out every echo of the party, still humming with delight. The light inside was dim, soft enough for me to feel the sway still lingering in my chest. The driver asked whether to take me home right away. I nodded, then leaned back against the seat. The city slid past quickly, lights brushing across the window like short streaks. I followed those streaks without attaching any emotion to them until my handbag vibrated faintly. The phone screen lit up, casting light through the dark interior of the car. It made me blink once. I opened it without thinking much, wanting to check quickly before arriving home. But when the first line appeared, I sat upright, my breath sharpening, as though every nerve had been reset. If you pull out Hartwell, may collapse within 60-90 days. I stared at the sentence for several long seconds, as if each word was rearranging the meaning of the entire evening. The email came from Reed Horizon's legal department, reminding me that Hartwell Group was waiting for my final signature to complete the $870 million deal. A deal I had agreed to in principle with just one document left for me to approve before funds could be released. The very deal that Hartwell's family was depending on to keep their company standing. I remembered Miranda's eyes, every cold word she had spoken, remembered Ariel's smile on the stage, remembered Jalen saying I was overreacting. The banquet hall with all its glitter suddenly felt small and naive compared to the truth resting in my hands. They thought I stood beneath them, believed their power reached higher, believed I had nothing but silence to absorb what they threw at me. But as I read that email, I knew the truth stood in a place none of them had imagined. A soft laugh slipped out in the dark, not carrying joy, but carrying clarity like a sharpened blade. They called me a cow, I whispered. Without knowing, I am the oxygen tank keeping their whole house alive. The sentence echoed in the small car, quiet but heavy with the weight of a power none of them recognized. I scrolled through the email again, seeing detailed warnings about bad debts, upcoming loan deadlines, and Hartwell's near-total dependence on Reed Horizons to avoid a catastrophic chain reaction. I turned my head and looked out the window. Buildings drifted behind me, light sliding across my face, and in each cast, I felt a calmness return. Not the calmness of someone enduring, but the calmness of someone who suddenly sees the entire chessboard. The night was no longer about being humiliated at the party or about Jalen choosing his wife over me. The night became an answer to a question fate had placed before me. I opened another email below it, a risk report from the investment team. A red marked line stood out. If not signed within 48 hours, Hartwell will face severe liquidity loss. I folded the phone, my palm resting on my knee, and in that quiet space, I knew the decision had been made. No need for anger, no need to assert myself with words, no need to raise my voice or confront any member of their family. Silence was the strongest blow. I would act, and my action would speak louder than anything said in that banquet hall. I looked at the clock, watching the second hand drift calmly forward, as if the world were waiting for my cue. When the car stopped in front of my house, I opened the door and stepped out, feeling the night air touch my skin. The coldness I felt leaving the party was gone. What I felt now was the beginning of a storm with me at its center. I climbed the steps, opened my front door, and just as I reached for the light switch in the living room, my phone vibrated again. A message from my assistant in Singapore sent in the late hours of the night. Sterling just saw the video. He realized his whole family made a fatal mistake. I stared at the screen, my eyes widening in the quiet darkness. The storm officially began here. In Singapore, inside an apartment perched high above the glowing city, Sterling Hartwell opened his laptop to check the last emails of the day. He was the only one in the Hartwell family who still held on to the practical instincts of real business, the only one who understood that behind the glamorous lights were bleak reports the rest of his family chose to ignore. When the video sent by a partner appeared on his screen, he expected another routine issue. But the first face that appeared made his heart drop sharply. He saw Ariel holding a microphone, saw her smiling with triumphant ease, saw me standing in the center of a crowded hall. When the infamous sentence came out, Sterling shot to his feet, the chair crashing behind him unnoticed. He rewound the video, squinted at the screen, then slammed his hand on the desk. "Good God, that's Marceline Reed," he shouted, his voice trembling with panic. "Are you all insane?" What he saw wasn't a petty social insult. It was a death sentence his own family had written for themselves. He paced the room, fingers clutching his hair, his face pale under the harsh white lights. Sterling was the only one who knew the full truth about Hartwell Group's condition, the only one aware that the $870 million deal wasn't an option, but the lone lifebuoy keeping them above water. He watched the video again, not to understand, but to confirm that his family had indeed committed a catastrophic mistake. Every word from Ariel sounded like the dragging metal of a gate slamming shut on an empire. He snatched his phone and dialed Miranda with the desperation of someone clinging to a cliff's edge. The moment the call connected, he bellowed into the receiver, his voice sharp with fear. "Miranda, do you have any idea what you've done?" He didn't let her speak, driving every word like a blade. "You insulted the woman holding the deal that will save this company. You insulted the CEO controlling $870 million of our future." On the other end, Miranda still failed to grasp the magnitude of the situation, dismissing it as another social clash. Her indifference made Sterling's hands shake with fury. He strode to the wide window, staring down at the stream of cars as though they might offer a solution. "That is Marceline Reed, for heaven's sake," he muttered, his voice sinking with dread. "If she pulls out Hartwell, won't even have time to breathe." The final words left him like a dark prophecy underlined 3 times. Sterling knew every number in their financial reports, knew their reputation could no longer shield the growing mass of bad debt. And what terrified him most was this: I was the only person alive who could decide whether they survived. Without wasting another minute, he rushed to his desk, opened the airline's website, and booked the earliest flight to New York. His fingers trembled as he typed, his heart beat loud enough to echo in his ears. When the confirmation email arrived, he exhaled like someone who had been underwater too long. He knew he had to return immediately, had to beg for forgiveness if necessary, had to be the one to fix the disaster Miranda and Ariel had unleashed. Sterling packed within minutes, throwing everything into a suitcase without folding. He stood before the mirror staring at his own reflection, seeing the lines of fear etched across the face of a man old enough to know how quickly a family empire could crumble. He told himself he had to find me, had to explain, had to plead, had to salvage what little future Hartwell had left. By the time he left the apartment, the Singapore night had deepened, the wind carrying the scent of the sea and the humidity rising from the towers. Sterling hurried through the lobby and flagged a taxi like a man racing the clock. In the car, he replayed the video again, and with each viewing, his face darkened further. He tried to imagine an apology strong enough, tried to imagine a solution large enough, but every possibility collapsed like waves against stone. His flight departed hours later. He barely blinked the entire trip, staring out into the night beyond the window, the aircraft lights flickering like unstable heartbeats. Sterling kept his phone in his hand the whole time, praying that he would still be in time to speak to me, in time to mend something before everything turned to dust. But in New York, before he could even step onto the airport's carpet, my decision had already gone ahead of him. By the time he returned, I had already signed. The next morning, before sunlight had slipped through the curtains, I heard the doorbell ringing in urgent, insistent bursts. My house, usually quiet and spacious, suddenly felt tightened by whatever tension waited outside. I walked to the door and opened it, finding Jalen standing there with his hair disheveled from lack of sleep, his face hardened in a way I had never seen on my son. He didn't wait for me to invite him in. He pushed past gently but firmly, as though he had come to deliver a confrontation he couldn't postpone. I kept a few steps of distance between us, enough to observe every detail in his expression. There was no remorse, no trace of the little boy who used to hug me when he was scared. What stood on the other side of the room was a man strung tight with frustration, ready to say something he knew would wound me. Jalen took a long breath, then faced me fully, his voice carrying accusation. "Mom, you embarrassed Ariel. I have to stand by my wife." I felt the weight of that sentence settle on my chest, heavy like a stone dropped from a height. He had come straight to my house without asking if I was all right, without mentioning what had happened in front of 300 people the night before, without knowing how I had walked out of that place with my dignity shredded by the family he married into. He brought blame and nothing else. I looked at him deeply, trying to find even a sliver of the child who once ran toward me across an elementary school courtyard, calling Mommy. I asked him one question, the only one my heart needed to hear, to understand whether I still held any place in his life. And me? Where were you standing when they humiliated me? My voice didn't tremble, but beneath every word was a thin layer of exhaustion. I needed him to understand that last night wasn't a silly social clash. It was a wound cut into the person whose blood runs through his veins. Jalen met my eyes briefly, and that glance told me everything. He had decided long before stepping into my home. He didn't need to think, didn't need to weigh my pain, didn't need to recall who brought him into this world and raised him for nearly 3 decades. He exhaled sharply, then answered with a decisiveness that felt almost cruel. "Ariel is my priority." The sentence echoed in my living room like a blade slicing the final thread between us. Everything after that fell into a silence so dense I could hear the ticking of the wall clock one beat at a time. In that silence, I understood clearly that my son had chosen the Hartwell world, chosen the fragile luxury they dangled in front of him, chosen all that over standing beside his mother when she was publicly torn apart. Jalen stepped forward as if to reinforce his stance. "I don't want this to get worse. You should apologize to Ariel to end it." I looked at him and said nothing. Some pain is so deep, it strips language of meaning. From the moment he said those words, the bond between us was no longer intact. He had cut it himself, and I could not mend what he no longer wished to hold. Moments later, he turned and left my house, the sound of the closing door leaving even more emptiness behind. I sat on the chair near the window, where the daylight had begun to spread across the floor. The hurt inside me expanded quietly, like a bruise rising beneath the skin. But beneath that hurt, something else was stirring, steady and sharp. The party had revealed who the Hartwells truly were, but this morning revealed something far more defining, Jalen's choice. And that choice was the final confirmation of what I needed to do. I stood, walked to my desk, and opened the folder I had left there the night before. The Hartwell Group contract sat inside the final page, holding an empty line reserved for my signature. Every word they said, every look they gave me, Miranda's voice behind my back, Ariel's laughter on the stage, Jalen's voice this morning, all of it aligned into a straight path leading me toward a single decision. I picked up my pen, rolling it once between my fingers. The room was so silent, I could hear the faint scratch of ink beginning to touch paper. I signed my name, the strokes firm and final, closing one chapter and opening another. When the last curve of my signature settled on the page, I set the pen down, looking at the contract as the meaning of that act solidified. I had signed. The decision to withdraw from the $870 million deal was now activated, and in that moment, their world began to crack open. The contract still lay open on my desk when I called the legal department, my voice steady enough that even I could feel the cold edge in each word. Withdraw from negotiations effective immediately. There was no objection, no question, only a brief silence on the other end, as if they needed a heartbeat to confirm that I had truly ended one of the year's largest deals. When the call ended, I set the phone down and looked toward the window where morning light stretched across the floor. There was no satisfaction, only the sense that everything was moving toward the direction truth demanded. News traveled faster than I expected. Just hours later, the market shifted as if a boulder had been hurled into still water. The first report delivered to me showed that banks immediately froze all credit lines extended to Hartwell Group. Their already depleted cash flow was now cut off entirely, like a major artery clamped shut. I studied the numbers on the screen, knowing this was the beginning of the collapse that would spread over the next few hours. Hartwell stock plunged straight down, losing 62% in a single morning. The trading board glowed red flames, licking up the walls of the prestige the Hartwell family had spent generations building. I knew those numbers weren't just a graph, but the unraveling of market confidence, a warning that the once luxurious name was entering its darkest hour. I sat quietly watching the line drop lower and lower without feeling the slightest tremor inside. By noon, the press began questioning Hartwell Group's internal stability. Several financial newspapers released analyses with bold headlines, audit gaps, or hidden fraud. Reporters flooded Hartwell's offices with calls, none of which were answered. Their silence only fueled speculation, pouring oil onto a fire already crackling through the investment world. I knew Miranda and the executive board had to be in emergency meetings, racing to patch holes too large for them to cover. By afternoon, I received an updated report from the risk team. The message was short, sharp. Foreign investors have withdrawn from 3 Hartwell-linked funds. Liquidity compromised. Restructuring prospects low. I placed the report on the table, inhaled slowly. In that moment, I understood that the Hartwell empire wasn't metaphorically burning. It was collapsing in real time, consumed not by flames, but by numbers and the unforgiving pressure of the market. When the sky faded into a pale gray, the doorbell rang. The sound was strained, desperate, like someone knocking with the last of their hope. When I opened the door, Sterling stood there, his face drawn and hollow, as if he had walked through a battlefield. His suit was wrinkled, his tie off center, his eyes red from what must have been a sleepless night. He looked at me for a long moment, and in his gaze I saw the downfall of a man who once believed his family was untouchable. "Marceline," he said, his voice trembling, "please, save at least our employees." He stepped a little closer, searching my face for even a sliver of mercy. "You don't have to save Hartwell or Miranda or the ones who caused this, but the thousands of workers at the company, they don't deserve this." I stood silently for a few seconds looking into Sterling's eyes filled with fear, but also the faint trace of decency his family rarely showed. I knew he meant what he said. I knew he wasn't. Miranda wasn't Ariel. But I also knew this wasn't the moment to undo my decision because of a flicker of sympathy. I answered with a calmness that felt carved from stone. "I don't save arrogance." The sentence carried no anger, no revenge, only the truth I was obligated to speak. Sterling stepped back slightly, as if he had just heard the verdict he feared yet hoped to escape. He nodded slowly, then turned away, his shoulders heavy with the ashes of everything his family had built. As the door closed, I stood in the stillness of my home. Outside, the world was shaking from a single signature. Inside, a strange quiet settled like the closing of a chapter that had waited too long to end. But the storm had not reached its peak. I felt it in every breath I took. And the next person to face the blow was Ariel. That afternoon, the sky was so gray, the trees outside my house cast almost no shadows. I was sorting through a stack of documents when I heard pounding on the door. Not the polite knock of a visitor, but the sound of someone clinging to their last thread of hope. I walked out to open it and found Ariel standing there, her eyes bloodshot, mascara streaked in 2 black lines down her cheeks. Her hair, usually styled to perfection, hung limp and tangled, as if she had run a long distance without stopping. Her breath trembled, her shoulders rising and falling with each suppressed sob. "Mrs. Reed," she said, her voice breaking, "please save us. We've lost everything." The words spilled out like a confession, like the cry of someone who had just watched her world collapse beneath her feet. I looked at her without rushing to respond, and in that moment, I realized it was the first time Ariel had ever spoken to me with truth in her eyes, without disguise, without arrogance, without the polished shine her family always wore. Ariel stood on my porch, her expensive dress stained with dust, one heel bent as though she had walked through the ruins of her own downfall. From afar, no one would believe she was the same woman who once glowed under the banquet lights, smiling as she humiliated me before 300 people. But now, her eyes held the panic of someone whose ground was rapidly disappearing beneath her feet. "Mrs. Reed," she repeated weaker this time, as if every word dragged the weight of her family's fate behind it. "Please have mercy just once." I didn't answer, letting silence stretch between us. That silence made Ariel cry harder, her tears no longer elegant, no longer restrained, but raw and desperate, like someone finally stripped of illusions. At last she spoke again, ripped open by something larger than her pride. "You don't understand. We have nothing left. The banks froze our accounts. Investors ran. My mother is being questioned. The media is calling us a rotten empire." Her voice cracked, and she grabbed the doorframe to keep herself standing. "People like us don't survive falling from that high, Mrs. Reed." I let her words settle. Then I asked softly, yet firmly, "Then tell me this. That night when you held the microphone, when you called me an ugly cow, what did you feel?" Ariel looked at me, her swollen eyes full of confusion and dread. She hadn't expected that question. She didn't look away, but lowered her head. After a long pause, she whispered, barely audible, "My mother taught me to." Tears welled again, mixing with the mascara streaks. My mother said, "People like you are born to be humiliated. I just did what she told me to." Her words stretched the silence, making it heavier, almost suffocating. I saw in her admission not victory, not justice, but a toxic lineage passed down from mother to daughter, a cruelty polished by privilege. She waited for my reaction, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. She looked like someone waiting for a verdict. I stepped closer, meeting her gaze directly. "Pain is not an excuse to become cruel," I said. Each word landed clean without anger. "You may have been taught to look down on others, but it was you who chose to use those lessons to hurt people. And that night, you didn't follow anyone. You chose to stand on a stage and humiliate me." Ariel shook her head, tears dripping onto her hands. You don't understand. I was scared of my mother. I had to. I lifted a hand, gently stopping her mid-sentence. Everyone fears something, Ariel, but good people don't use fear as a knife. Her lips trembled, her shoulders shaking as she tried to steady herself. Please, please give us another chance. We'll fix it. I'll kneel if I have to. I saw her preparing to drop to her knees, but I stepped back. I'm not the person you need to beg, I said. Truth is what you have to face. My hand reached for the door handle. Ariel's eyes widened in panic, as if she saw the final escape close before her. Mrs. Reed! The door closed before she could finish. Wind brushed through the gap beneath the door, and her muffled sobs echoed on the porch before fading into silence. I didn't look back. I walked to the living room and sat down, feeling a chapter fold itself shut. But I knew the night ahead would not be quiet. Because the one who knelt at my door that night was Jalen. Night fell heavy, like a thick velvet curtain draped across the entire neighborhood. I sat in my living room, the warm yellow light above casting a dim circle around me. Everything that had happened during the day still moved through my mind like pages flipped too fast to fully settle. I thought the night would pass quietly, but the sudden knocking at my door carried such desperation that I knew immediately it could only be one person. I walked to the door and opened it, and what I saw made me pause. Jalen was kneeling on the doorstep, his face bowed to his knees, his shoulders shaking. The streetlight reflected off his disheveled hair, highlighting 2 long trails of tears down his cheeks. The suit he had worn the day before was wrinkled, the hem stained, as though he had wandered the city searching for the last place he could cling to. Mom, his voice cracked as he lifted his head, his eyes swollen from crying. I was wrong. I've lost everything. Each word fell to the stone steps like fragments of the arrogance he once carried. I didn't speak immediately, only looked at the grown man whom I had once walked to elementary school, now kneeling before my door like someone stripped of breath. A breeze passed through the porch, carrying the sound of Jalen's choked sobs. He braced his hands against the step like a drowning man grasping at a fragile straw. His eyes lifted to mine, full of fear, panic, and despair. He no longer carried the calm confidence he had worn that morning when he came to blame me. He no longer carried the forced strength of a man choosing his wife to prove maturity. All of that had collapsed, leaving only a lost child returning when the world had taken everything from him. Mom, I don't know what to do anymore, he said through uneven breaths. Ariel left. My job's been suspended. They're blaming me for damaging the brand. The media says I'm tied to her family's scandal. Friends won't talk to me. Her company shut me out. He clenched his fists, trembling. I've lost everything, Mom. There's nothing left. I looked at him for a long time. A flicker of sorrow passed through me, the instinctive ache of a mother's heart. But that flicker could not erase what he had said that morning. He had stood in this very house, looked me in the eyes, and said, Ariel is my priority. He had severed the last thread between us with a sentence colder than any insult. Jalen took a shaky breath, trying to gather himself. I know I was wrong. Mom, please say something. Don't stay silent like this. I didn't break eye contact. The silence between us wasn't distance. It was truth, and truth weighed more than comfort ever could. I finally spoke, my voice soft enough to avoid being a slap, but sharp enough to leave no space for denial. You chose them, I said, and that was your final choice. Jalen's expression crumpled as if I had extinguished the last bit of light inside him. His shoulders fell, his hands loosened, his face turning hollow with realization. He didn't argue. Perhaps he knew that the moment he spoke those words to me earlier in the day, the path behind him had closed forever. I held his gaze a moment longer. Though my heart carried wounds he had carved, I knew I could not gather into my arms a grown man who had turned his back on me when I needed him most. Some lessons in life arrive with cruelty because they cannot be learned any other way. I reached for the door. Jalen lurched upward reflexively. "Mom, don't." But the door had already closed before he could reach my hand. The sound of it closing wasn't loud, but it marked the final boundary between us. Outside, I heard his breath falter, then a low, broken sob. Inside, the quiet of my house settled again, so deep I could hear my own heartbeat evening out. I stood behind the closed door for a moment, eyes shut, holding myself steady. When I walked back into the living room, the heaviness that had filled the air seemed to lift just enough to create space for something new. As my son knelt outside, like a man watching his future crumble, I understood that fate was pulling me toward a moment larger than any personal sorrow, and I was preparing to step onto the biggest stage of my life. The morning of the international press conference opened with an atmosphere unlike any day that had come before. The city shimmered under the sunlight, and I stood before the large glass panel in the preparation room, watching my reflection in a plain suit. Not to impress, but to remind myself that I had reached the final point of a road lined with thorns. After Jalen, after Ariel, after Sterling, after the hollow world the Hartwells had built, today was the day truth became light. And that was the only thing I intended to carry onto the stage before the world. When the side door to the stage opened, the sound of cameras clicking swept across the hall in waves. I stepped out, each step steady, neither rushed nor hesitant. The lights above cast a clear glow over my face, and I felt hundreds of eyes turn toward me. At the front, the podium, bearing the Reed Horizons logo, waited, marking the bridge between everything I had endured and everything I was about to create. I stood before the microphone, took a short breath, and spoke. We are investing $870 million in companies that respect women. The hall tightened for a heartbeat, then erupted into thunderous applause. Cameras flashed like bursts of white fire. Reporters leaned forward, scribbling, recording, sending off each word as it left my lips. And I knew this was not merely a financial announcement, but a declaration of the values my company stood for. I continued speaking about our new partner, about how the investment would help them expand internationally, about the clauses centered on human rights and ethical governance. The more I spoke, the more energy filled the room. Some nodded, others exchanged approving glances. They understood that Reed Horizons had just delivered a powerful message to the entire industry. Behind me, the screen updated in real time, Reed Horizons stuck, climbing with sharp, confident strokes. The green line rose like an arrow cutting through the air. International outlets released immediate headlines. CEO Marceline Reed leads a new era of ethical investment. A values revolution in business begins with Reed Horizons. I saw the reactions and knew the world was aligning with my decision. As I stepped off the stage and into the private conference room, my assistant handed me a tablet showing the latest updates on Hartwell Group. I paused to read. The screen glowed with the cold clarity of numbers collapsing. Miranda had officially been removed from her position, the Oversight Committee launching a full investigation for signs of accounting fraud. Several news outlets published photos of her ducking away from cameras as she left the building, hair disheveled, expression stiff with humiliation she had never imagined tasting. I looked at the image for a long moment. No triumph, no pity, only the quiet acknowledgement of inevitability. A new update appeared from an internal source. Ariel has left the Hartwell estate, now living in a cheap rental apartment on the outskirts. A photo was attached. She sat on a hallway floor, knees pulled to her chest, An old coat draped over her shoulders. No lights, no polished appearance, only the darkness settling around a woman who had never truly understood how the world worked. The final note read, she said, "We've destroyed ourselves." I set the tablet down, stepped to the nearby table for a sip of water, and let the faint taste of mint settle on my tongue. In that quiet moment, the image of the banquet night resurfaced. The lights, the laughter, the sentence she flung at me. Then Jalen kneeling on my porch. Each scene replayed like a dark film, making way for the bright present. I walked to the tall window and looked down at the city moving beneath me. The lines of traffic, the buildings gleaming with noon sun. Everything sharp, clear, like the sky after a storm, so clean it almost hurt the eyes. I asked myself whether I regretted anything. The answer rose instantly without hesitation. No. Justice is never cruel when it arrives at the right time to the right people. The Hartwells built their empire on arrogance and glitter layered over decay. I hadn't dragged them down. They had placed every stone on the path that led them to the fall. And with that understanding, I knew the words waiting at the edge of my lips, the truth that would close this chapter. I turned back, picked up the new set of documents, and walked out of the room, ready to face the rounds of questions from reporters waiting outside. They wanted reasons, explanations, the story in my own voice. I stepped toward them with a steady stride and an even breath. And in that moment, I whispered the final line to myself, a truth that needed no microphone. And I never needed revenge. I only needed to let them sink on their own. That evening, when I stepped out of the convention center, the city was already lit. The buildings glowed like giant mirrors, reflecting a chapter that had just closed. The wind brushed lightly across my shoulder, carrying the feeling of one door shutting and another opening wide under the weight of truth. I walked slowly along the stone pavement, the sound of my heels echoing evenly. No more insults, no more people trying to shove me beneath their feet, only a strange calm, the kind of calm one finds after rising from the cruelest blows. I thought about everything that had happened, about the downfall of an arrogant empire, about the faces once overflowing with pride, now curling into themselves, inside the darkness they created. Then I realized something. True power is not found in striking back. It lies in standing firm in the face of cruelty without losing yourself. I stopped at a crosswalk, the red light washing over my face. In that moment, I saw in the reflection on a storefront window a woman who no longer carried pain, but carried the brightness of resolve. A woman who understood that dignity is not something granted by others, but something forged from the strength within. The world outside remained noisy, but inside me was a silence strong enough to build an empire. And I understood that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to walk toward the light, leaving behind those who choose the dark. In the end, I did not choose revenge. I chose truth. And truth, when sharp enough, will always find its way to answer every cruelty in this world. I lifted my head and stepped across the illuminated crosswalk. Tomorrow and every day after belonged to me.